Now, more poetically, what I propose to do tonight, I'd like to consider an exchange of gifts. Because I'm very conscious when I speak to a group like this of the gift of your time and attention to me. I treasure that, I value it highly. And I hope in return to give you the gift of my insight into some very important issues, which in fact are creating danger for you and your families today as we speak. And I hope to offer you some hope for a way forward in perilous times. When I think about the best way to communicate ideas, I'm always reminded of a story about two gentlemen in the early days of air flight who were experimenting with ballooning. And they got aloft in this balloon, and sure enough, they didn't know what they were doing. They lost control. They began to drift. They didn't spot a river or a mountain or a lake or anything they recognized, but they did see a solitary man walking along a path down below. So they lowered a little bit, and they shouted down to him, "Where are we?" And he thought about it for a while, scratched his head, and after a moment he shouted back, "You're up in a balloon." And as they floated away, the one fellow turned to the other and he said, "You know, that fellow must have been a lawyer because everything he said was totally true but also perfectly useless." Now, I did spend 30 years almost practicing law. I'm trained as a lawyer, but I hope that my words to you tonight will not only be very true, but will also be highly useful to you in facing the challenges I'm going to discuss. At November's Remembrance Day ceremony, when you hear people praising the brave men and women in uniform who have fought and sacrificed and even died to protect our freedom, ask yourself, did they fight and sacrifice and die to protect our freedom to follow our own conscience without being ordered to violate it? Of course they did. Ask yourself, did they fight and sacrifice and die to protect our freedom to worship as we choose? Of course they did. Did they fight to preserve our right to speak in public? Naturally so. Well, in fact, they also fought so that we could live in a nation of laws, to be ruled by laws that are based on truth and justice. The sad truth is, though, that in just the last 5 years, Canada has entered a new era, an era where public authorities have seen fit to eradicate the fundamental freedoms of those who disagree with them. And Canadians have enjoyed freedom for so long that we find it hard to believe, even when we see freedoms being eliminated across our country. We don't want to believe it. I've spoken to many Canadians. They don't believe it. And in fact, so long as the freedoms that are being eliminated are someone else's freedoms and not our own, it's very easy for us to pretend that Canada is still a free nation for all. But the truth is, it no longer is a free nation for all. I'm not here tonight to fill you with facts and figures. I am here to call you to action, to enlist you in a great and necessary and noble battle to preserve our fundamental individual freedoms and democracy itself. The threat that I'm here to speak to you about tonight isn't a humorous one by any means. It's in fact a very ominous one. But even in dark times, a little bit of humor can be a good tonic. And I often think of Winston Churchill, who led his nation through very perilous times, but who also had a very sharp and funny wit. My favorite story about Winston Churchill involves a dispute, a very acrimonious dispute that he is said to have had with a woman MP from another party in the House of Commons who rose in her seat and declared quite indignantly, "Mr. Churchill, if you were my husband, I would put poison in your tea." And without batting an eyelash and without missing a beat, Churchill rose in his seat and replied very gravely, "Madam, if I was your husband, I would drink that tea." Well, he was a man of words, and he led his nation to victory and to freedom. But I want to return to the more sober theme of my remarks here tonight. And that is that Canada has entered a new era. An undeclared war is now being waged in Canada upon freedom and democracy. Our children and our grandchildren are going to be oppressed by tyrants. And many Canadians are simply sleepwalking through the battle, completely ignoring the victims. I want to tell you a little bit about my life story because it's important for you to know where I'm coming from. I'll begin by telling you I was born in 1954, so now you know how old I am. The importance of that is that it was just 6 short years after the free nations of the world found the words to express the irreducible minimum legal requirement for any civilized democracy. The wise leaders of the free world in 1948 in the UN Declaration of Human Rights declared the following. They said, recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation for freedom, for peace, and for justice in the world. And never in all my life did I dream that the Parliament of Canada would reject that irreducible precondition for democracy, and yet it did in 2012. When I was young, justice and freedom were in the very air we breathed. In fact, I was born less than 100 years after, in the United States, slavery was abolished. Slavery which denied African Americans the equality and the worth and dignity that any member of the human family deserves. I still have a hard time believing it was just under 100 years before I was born. In fact, in those days, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement were well respected eventually and highly regarded for having fought a battle to enshrine equality and human dignity in American law. I was also born just 25 years after the British Privy Council abolished the unjust Canadian statute which denied women legal recognition and equality under Canadian law. And in my youth, many efforts were made to achieve equality for women without in any way denying or diminishing the worth and dignity of any other human being. Now, I also grew up in the shadow of the totalitarian Soviet Union. Those who were trapped in that system had very little private life. Independent religions were outlawed. Free speech was suppressed. Children were taken away from their parents at a very early age and raised in public institutions. The state determined what you would study. The state determined what your livelihood would be. The state seized the fruit of your labor. What a cold pall that tyranny cast over the whole world. And what jubilation greeted its collapse in the 1980s. I was there and I remember it. But have we forgotten our history so thoroughly that we're willing to let that kind of tyranny creep into Canada in the 21st century? Are there any other people here who remember the Soviet Union? Would you raise your hands? Very good, most of us. Let's not forget it, and let's teach our children. My mother used to read often to me from the news headlines at the kitchen table. In fact, she is the one who drilled into my head and acquainted me with the phrase, man's inhumanity toward man. And she taught me to abhor that. My mother was even a fan of Ralph Nader because he championed with empathy and compassion those who were weak and helpless and unable to defend themselves. And don't forget, I also grew up in the afterglow of the defeat of Nazi tyranny. My father fought in Europe during World War II. And it was just 9 years after that war ended that I was born. The judgment at Nuremberg decided and held that just following orders was not going to be a legal excuse for doing anything unconscionable. What people don't remember and think about is the corollary to that. The other side of that coin is that it means that no civilized democracy, no civil authority in a civilized democracy can legitimately order anyone to do anything that they believe to be unconscionable. That's what we learned from that bitter experience. What a glorious time for freedom and justice and equality it was in my youth. I was just 13 years old when the people of Australia voted that Aboriginals, for the first time ever in Australian history, would be recognized as human beings for the purpose of counting in their census. Now, I have to tell you, unfortunately, that 10% of Australians voted against that measure and voted instead to preserve the savage and inhumane perjury which denied the very worth and dignity of their fellow human beings. Never in my life did I predict that members of the Canadian Parliament would adopt the same savage and inhumane perjury in denying the humanity of individuals that we know perfectly well are human beings. Yet in 2012, that's precisely what Parliament did. Friends, how long has it been in Canada since anyone dared to deny the worth and dignity of any human being? Until today, in our own time, in our own country. I tell you, it's actually almost unbelievable that it happened. To me, anyway. And perhaps you can understand that, given the upbringing that I had and the times that I came to maturity in. And how long will it be, friends, before we rise up, you and I, in order to restore justice and freedom in our country? In 2012, I told Parliament about Canada's false 400-year-old legal definition of human being, and I put it up on the screen there for you. You can see that it denies that any child is a human being unless and until the last part of that child's body has left his or her mother's body. And it doesn't even matter if the child is breathing. If they are still within the birth canal, our law denies the worth and dignity of that child. And even Justice Bertha Wilson of the Supreme Court of Canada, who wrote the most generous, the most expansive, the most supportive legal judgment favoring abortion in the history of Canada, recognized that that law was a lie and called on Parliament to revise it. And this is what she said. That's exactly the proposal, by the way, that I made to Parliament and that Parliament rejected. Now, as a lawyer, if I send a witness into a courtroom to assert a false fact, I am guilty of suborning perjury. I would, first of all, if it became known, I'd be publicly shamed. I would be disbarred from practicing law. Chances are I would be thrown in jail. And it is no less perjury for Parliament to send a law into courtrooms across our nation to assert such an inhumane and savage false fact about who is not or is a human being. It is just as much perjury, it is just as shameless, and in fact, it is alarming for Parliament to do that, and I'm going to tell you why. When people in power refuse to recognize the equal worth and dignity of any human being, or the inalienable rights of you or of others. They are placing themselves above you. And when they do that, it is an exercise of nothing less than sheer tyranny. It is rule by whim. It effectively abolishes the rule of law that our ancestors fought and died and sacrificed to protect. Some of you may think, well, this is just some kind of an abstract legal point that doesn't have anything to do with you and doesn't affect you. But I'm here to tell you otherwise, because by intentionally denying the humanity of some human beings, Parliament has put each and every one of you in danger. An excuse or an ideology can always be found in favor of tyranny, but tyranny is never justified. And in fact, tyranny never stops with a single victim. Just weeks, in fact, after I presented my request to Parliament to study this issue and to ask Parliament to recognize the equal worth and dignity of every human being, just as we are called on to do in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Just weeks after that, two so-called bioethicists published a paper in a perfectly respectable medical magazine, the Journal of Medical Ethics Online, in which they proposed that newborn infants should no longer be recognized in law as human beings possessing the worth and dignity that a human being should possess. And I often wonder that people may think that I'm making this up. So I've copied out the headline of their article, "After Birth Abortion, Why Should the Baby Live?" And here is their conclusion, claiming killing a newborn child could be ethically permissible. Well, democracy preserves private thought and activity free of restraint by civil authorities. And when the Declaration of Human Rights describes your dignity, the dignity of every member of the human family, as inherent, it is pointing out that your dignity is not a gift from the government. Your dignity exists independent of any government power. In fact, it doesn't depend on the government. And here's what it really comes down to. Those in power, if they are acting legitimately, must recognize your human dignity. And when the Declaration of Human Rights describes your equal, fundamental, individual rights as inalienable, it is highlighting that no government has the right to take away your fundamental freedoms. You possess a free, private sphere of thought and activity within which to govern yourself, so long as you don't impede anyone else. And when those in power invade anyone else's private sphere of thought or activity, they diminish freedom in the world, they diminish justice in the world, they diminish peace in the world, and not just for their victims, but for everyone. That's why we are all endangered. When that happens, as it now has happened in Canada, civil authorities lack the restraint that is required by democracy. They become tyrants who are, quote, more equal than others, to paraphrase, to use George Orwell's ironic phrase. No one is safe if we let powerful people trample upon the rights of any individual or group. And that's why you should be extremely worried that Parliament in 2012 voted to deny the human dignity of some human beings. Today in Canada, tyranny has yet another face. Civil authorities in Canada today are now punishing those who refuse their orders to cooperate in procedures that the doctors who are being ordered feel are crimes against humanity. I'm speaking now of regulations from the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons. I'm speaking of the recommendations of the Parliamentary Committee on Assisted Suicide. How long has it been in Canada since any civil authority has dared to order someone to do something that that person believes is unconscionable and a crime against humanity? How long has it been? And how long will it be before you and I rise up to restore freedom of conscience in Canada? Further, today in Canada, civil authorities are punishing some law graduates simply because of their affiliation with a peaceful and private religious church community which happens to dissent from the religious beliefs of the authorities governing law societies. The punishment inflicted on these law students seems intended to indirectly punish the church group with whom they are affiliated. That punishment seems intended to compel that church community to give up some of its religious doctrine, or at the very least, to admit into their church community people who actively disagree with their religious doctrine. I'm speaking, of course, of the case of Trinity Western University and the tyranny of civil authorities governing law societies. A religious community is easily defined. We know what a religious community looks like. And there is no question that Trinity Western University is a religious community. There's their mission statement. It makes it perfectly clear, that they are an arm of the church. Friends, how long has it been since any civil authority in Canada dared to punish someone because of their religious affiliation or because of the religious belief that they hold? And how long will it be before you and I rise up to restore religious freedom in Canada once more? Today in Canada, there are some administrators of state-funded universities who deny or penalize the free speech of people that they don't like. And I'm speaking now about the actions of administrators in some state-funded universities to suppress the free speech of pro-life students. Tyranny also emboldens some who, like the brown shirts of 1930s Germany, go to the gatherings of others to physically disrupt them so that their opponents are not able even to speak aloud in public. How long, friends, has it been in Canada since anyone has dared to celebrate the shutting down of free speech? Until now, in our own time, in our own country, in our own day. Just as we are shutting down freedom of conscience now, in our own time, in our own day. And just as we are shutting down freedom of religious worship and freedom of association, now, in our own day, all around us. Have you and other Canadians really surrendered your right to advocate for your own ideals? Is there anyone here who, like me, has not surrendered their right? Could you put your hand up? Most of us feel we have a right to advocate publicly for our own ideals. But in Canada today, tyranny has declared war on you. Tyranny has declared war on justice and democracy today. And because it is an undeclared stealth war, many Canadians don't even know that Canada's hard-won freedoms are under attack. Unless, of course, they happen to be the ones whose freedoms are being taken away, and then they're painfully aware of it. Surely, we have learned that in a democracy, it's best for all citizens if we protect everyone's fundamental individual freedoms, if for no other reason than to protect our future exercise of our fundamental individual freedoms. Shifts in public opinion, shifts in the belief set of those in power will mean that your own freedoms will come under attack in the future if you stand by and let the freedoms of others become oppressed in our own country today. Ladies and gentlemen, we just simply cannot let this happen to us in Canada. Our freedom is at stake. Our children's freedom and our grandchildren's freedom is at stake. It's past time for Canadians to once again rise up in defense of freedom and democracy. The same goals that our ancestors died and sacrificed for and fought for. We too have to fight for a Canada where we can once again worship freely, where we can once again speak freely in public places, where we have the right not to participate in any conduct that we believe is unconscionable, and where laws are based on truth and justice and not simply on the whim of those with power. Now, the most obvious thing that I want you to do, for me and for all of us, is to make the urgent necessity of this action known to the people around you. Tell your neighbors, tell your friends, tell your local communities, the people who don't even realize that freedom is disappearing in Canada. It's an urgent challenge. I'm not here today talking about some dark and far-off, distant future. I'm here telling you about what is happening in your country, in my country, today, as we speak. What else are we called to do in defense of democracy? Well, we ought to follow in the footsteps of those who came before us. We ought to put ourselves on the line just as they did. When Thomas More faithfully refused to endorse a view of marriage which his religion told him was wrong, he had his head cut off. Well, in Canada today, you don't have to worry about paying the ultimate sacrifice as he did yet. When Germans in the 1930s protested against the Nazi denial of human dignity, they risked confinement to a forced labor camp. Well, you don't have to worry about such an extreme punishment in Canada yet. When Martin Luther King Jr. marched in the streets, he was beaten, he was bruised, he was bloodied. Well, you don't have to worry about that in Canada yet. But we should be prepared to march. We should be willing to rally. We should be willing to demonstrate. We should be ready to physically show up in support of democratic individual freedoms. And we should do that even in the face of the inevitable abuse from those who oppose freedom and democracy. So let's devote some of our time, some of our strength, some of our treasure to the defense of democracy. Let's fight the tyranny of civil authorities today, now, when all we have to worry about are fines and suspensions. Let's fight to restrain tyranny now before anything worse comes about. We need to make our presence felt in a great many places. We already in the courts have a champion in the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and I want you to support that organization. I will even take donations from you for them tonight and deliver them myself, because they're doing great work in the courts. We also have candidates and representatives in government who have put their lives on hold to fight for freedom and justice. So support them, work in their campaigns, join their constituency associations. We have associations like ARPA Canada, who are working, promoting political action in their own church or fighting in the defense of particular victims who have lost their freedoms in Canada. So work with those associations, and we can enhance their efforts by bringing together freedom defenders from other associations. We need nonpartisan political action. I have a vision of an association of like-minded freedom defenders of all partisan stripes, of all religious denomination or no religious denomination, of all ages, of all occupations, who come together to vocally, visibly, and repeatedly speak up in defense of freedom and democracy. So I founded the Democracy Defense Initiative to fill that gap. And we will write letters and send cards, and we will march and rally. We will leave our comfort zone if necessary in order to preserve our democratic heritage. Friends, I cannot promise you that we will roll back the tide of tyranny that has rolled into Canada in the last 5 years. But I can tell you this: I don't intend to sit back and merely curse the darkness when I can at least light one small candle. And I'd like to help you to light your own small candle too, with me. So, for example, I invite you to join me on May 31st, when I will be, if necessary, standing by myself or with as many others as I can in front of the law courts and in front of the Law Society of British Columbia in support of religious freedom. Oppose the Law Society's treatment of Trinity Western University. Make your voices heard outside of this chamber. Make your voice heard in public. I also invite you to stay informed about the activities of the Democracy Defense Initiative. You will find somewhere here, James put them out for me, sign-up sheets where you can leave your contact information, and I will keep you apprised of what we are doing. And this is important because I do want you to let others in your communities know what's going on. I'd like you to stay informed. I'm going to close by telling you a little bit of the story of a 14th century king, Robert the Bruce. Robert the Bruce lost a big battle to the English invaders in Scotland. And with only a few supporters, he fled into hiding in the Hebrides and in Ireland. Although he was the rightful king of Scotland, he was on the run in the wilderness, facing inclement weather with very little food, very little shelter. Now, the interesting thing is, Robert the Bruce could have escaped to France. This was actually a common strategy of Scots who were defeated by the British. They would escape to France, but he refused to give up. He persevered. He gathered his strength. And his refusal to to give up, inspired others willing to fight for freedom in Scotland. Slowly, in twos or threes at first, he gathered together an army. Small battle after small battle, he eventually returned and defeated the English at Loudon Hill. He waged a guerrilla war for quite a number of years. In fact, it took over 20 years of unrelenting effort. But ultimately, he succeeded. He expelled the English conquerors. He restored Scottish independence. And so I ask you, isn't preserving the flame of freedom and democracy in Canada worth a similar persistence from us? Will you simply sit back and watch the flame of freedom extinguished in Canada? Or will you rise up and add your strength to ours? So I say, for the sake of your children's freedom, the time to act is now. For the sake of your grandchildren's freedom, the time to act is now. Do as little or as much as you can, but join with us in this absolutely essential and noble battle to preserve freedom and democracy in Canada. And next Remembrance Day, when you hear praises for the brave men and women in uniform who sacrifice to protect our freedom, you will know that you have added your valor to theirs. And you can only feel accomplished and satisfied when you realize that. So I trust the warning that I've sounded and the hope of common cause to which I have called you are adequate recompense for the time and attention that you've given me tonight. I am truly grateful. I thank you, and I wish you all Godspeed. Thank you very much.